to Shelter and Solidarity, a deep dive with artists and activists during this extended COVID pandemic. I'm your host, Joe Ramsey, Zoom casting with you here from Dorchester, Massachusetts on the south side of Boston, kicking off what is our first ever Shelter and Solidarity special edition. We're here with you on a Wednesday night. We will still be having our normal show on Thursday night tomorrow at 7 p.m. But here, due to emergency circumstances and a viable teaching moment, an opportunity we have here, we are joined by some terrific guests and a guest host who will be leading us into today's topic, Stepping Up for Texas, focusing on mutual aid, solidarity, and making sense of this ongoing crisis afflicting the people in and around Texas, which I'm sure many of you have been hearing about: the weather storms, the power outages, the outrageous bills. What does it all mean? How has it come to this? And what are the lessons to be learned and the opportunities that are opening up before us? Leading us into this vital discussion will be David Cobb. David Cobb, who is a longtime, I understand, originally from Texas, although now in the California area, active with the Solidarity Economy Network, the U.S. Solidarity Economy Network, as well as a fellow with the Liberty Tree Foundation for the Democratic Revolution, a revolution whose time, no doubt, has come. David, welcome to Shelter and Solidarity.
Well, thank you, Joe, and thank you for the great privilege of being allowed to guest host what is your normal program. So I feel honored to do that. I also want to say, like, straight up, y'all, I always identify myself as a revolutionary. I'm a nonviolent revolutionary, which is to say I eschew violence as an affirmative political tool, right? But I am a revolutionary because I believe we have to completely restructure this society. This society is fundamentally racist. It's fundamentally classist. It is fundamentally class oppressive. And as if that's not bad enough, and we can all agree that's bad, right? As if that's not bad enough, the huge transnational corporations that have basically hijacked economics are literally going to destroy this planet if we do not interrupt them and recreate society. So in that capacity as a lawyer, I've sued corporate polluters. I've lobbied elected officials. I've run for office myself. I ran for Attorney General of the great state of Texas, pledging to use that office to revoke the charters of corporations routinely violating health, safety, public interest, and environmental and worker protection laws. I ran for president of the United States on the Green Party ticket, and I've been arrested for nonviolent civil disobedience. So for real, y'all, all the tools, all the tactics, all the strategies. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to go one by one and introduce our panelists, if you will, but really our comrades, the people on the ground doing the work. And as a way of introduction, I'm going to introduce each of you and then just ask you each, say a word about yourself and your work, and also how are you doing through this crisis moment, and sort of what your experience was. Then we'll get into the deeper conversation. So I'm going to start with Zach, who is with Corpus Christi DSA. Zach, how are you at the moment? What happened to you?
Hello, everybody, and thank you for having me. I can say that I'm doing well, but it's definitely a struggle. Ever since the storm hit, our mutual aid working group here in Corpus Christi has been working round the clock to provide support for people. And while the work is worth it, it is tiring. But now that the storm has passed, everything is better. Now that relief is getting out to people, we're all heartened by everything. And we're finding unique opportunities because of this to build a base and build solidarity here in South Texas.
Thank you, Zach, and welcome. And let's turn now to Marc from I Love Third World. Marc.
Hey, I love Third Ward here. Marc, I'm actually in Third Ward right now. So basically, it gave me a chance to kind of like really see what's going on. Like, one thing with the pandemic and every kind of catastrophe that's come through Houston, it just kind of exposed like how the elites have just kind of like, they have all this power, but they don't do anything to help people with it. Like for us, it was like the energy grid and ERCOT and how we pronounce that. And how like I didn't know anything about that grid structure and who owned it, that it was privately owned. I just know that all the electricity was off. Like for so many Houstonians, and a lot of families were freezing, and that should not happen in a modern like United States at all. So it just kind of like showed me the corruption that just kind of the greed and corruption that's just kind of plagued this society.
Thank you, Mark. And for the non-Texans in the crowd, and again, as a native Houstonian myself, I got to say, Third Ward is the heart of Houston, Texas, home of George Foreman, to date myself, but also, the predominantly Black and low income area. These folks have been knowing how to survive in crisis condition for a long time, and we've got a lot to learn from the Third World. Let's turn now to Bill. And speaking of, Mark, that grid system, let's turn to Bill Medaille. Bill is an attorney based out of Austin. Bill.
Hi there. Thanks, David. Good evening, everyone. I'm Bill Medaille. I'm lifelong Texan. I've lived in Austin for many decades. I am not representing any organization. I'm an attorney here. I specialize in energy and finance. And yes, the grid is painfully complex and confusing. And I'm hoping can maybe able to answer some questions about that and understand the various aspects of it to help the conversation move forward. For myself, I'll just say I got very lucky. I was one of the relatively few people who never lost power throughout the entire crisis. And so you can kind of see the unbalance where some of us had power and water the whole time and others lost it for a week. But I'm very happy to be here and hope I can contribute. Thanks.
And let's welcome Alice Liu of the West End Recovery.
Hi, everyone. My name's Alice. My pronouns are she, her. I currently work with West End Recovery. We're doing rapid response and pipe repairs and mucking in Houston right now. I grew up in Dallas and I came to Houston for college my sophomore year. Hurricane Harvey hit, and that actually changed the course of my career. And since then, it's really just been progressing deeper and deeper into how mired Houston is in this petrochemical society. We're really on both ends of it in terms of being so car centric and also being the international hub of oil and gas. But I also was lucky enough not to lose power. But having grown up in Texas, I was texting all of my friends in Dallas and in Houston. And honestly, out of my network, like 2 to 3 people still had power during those 2 to 3 days of outages. So it really touched almost everyone in my life.
Thank you, Alice. And thank you for your kind and gentle correction of me. And thank you to Rachel. It is West Street Recovery, proving that we are all better than the mistakes that we make and that we're all better together. So that's the first of the mistakes that I'll make today. I know that there will be many others. And if you are loving and patient with me as I make my mistakes and we all do it together, we'll get to the world that we want to live in. Alice, thank you so much for being here. Let's turn now to Cristian of Sunrise and Latinx Dallas.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. My name is Cristian, he, him pronouns. Like David said, I organized with Sunrise and Latinx Dallas. Last week, I lost power for 3 days. It would come on randomly. First 2 days, we only got power for 6 hours. It was pretty cold in the house, but for the most part, we were okay. And I felt better because we had already been working with community organizations, providing food distributions, basic necessities to people here in Oak Cliff and around Dallas. When this winter storm came, all these groups jumped on board and started doing the same thing, just at a higher scale. We had tons more volunteers, over 100 people would come and help us out. And it was amazing to see, but it was also very disheartening because we should not have had to do that. Our government should have, and honestly, they never came. They didn't even plow the roads or salt the roads. So we were slipping and sliding, making deliveries 7 minutes away, just warm meals and groceries, everything that we had. But it gave me hope because we all were there together, and we showed up every single day, working hours and hours and tirelessly. But for the most part, we've been okay. We've still been doing mutual aid efforts every single day ever since. And thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for being here. And Cristian really set us up for the conversation, right? Like what we saw was that there was absolute misery. And we'll get into the context of exactly, Kira says, Rain has joined us. This is fantastic news. Rain from Louisiana Mutual Aid and Direct Relief, welcome to the program. And what we're doing is go around of the speakers to ask, how are you and what happened to you during the crisis moment?
Hello, hi everyone. This is Rain. I'm with Mutual Aid Disaster Relief, and we're a decentralized network that's kind of all over. I'm based in Louisiana, in Baton Rouge, and it's really great to be here with everybody. What happened to me over the winter storm was that I lost power for some days, and it was horrible because I'm from Florida and I was really cold. That's just like my personal issue. But what we've been doing in response was taking out just supplies. We went and raided as many heat warmers and hand warmers as we could, things like that, since we have the privilege of a vehicle. Started doing distribution around the local area in Baton Rouge, and in general have just been doing a lot of support for other mutual aid groups. So I'm sure everyone can speak better to their areas, but that's what was happening with me, where I was very cold and grateful to be able to help others out with a vehicle.
So again, thank you all. And really, let's just be honest, y'all. Like what we saw was a governmental failure of massive proportions, right? Like from local counties, state, and nationally. And my read, y'all, like this is what it looks like, right? Like we're seeing empire in collapse, decline. We're in the early stages of actually systems collapse. That's literally how I see it. So it's a failure of the empire. It's also late stage capitalism. Like this is going to happen more and more. Think about Katrina. Then we saw Sandy. Then we saw Harvey. Then we saw the California wildfires, right? I don't need to tell this group like the big picture, but I am going to ask, why did the entire Texas grid collapse? Bill, I kind of look to you to lead us through this, but so I'll start with you, Bill, and I'm gonna ask any of the panelists after you hear from Bill, if you've got something to add to that question or help us unpack that. But why the hell did this happen?
Wow, that's a tough one. Well, let's talk about what we know. First of all, when we say the Texas grid, remember Texas is kind of unique. The United States is broken up into 9 grids, basically, independent systems. The other 8 are aggregated into 2 giant, what's called the Western Interconnect and Eastern Interconnect. And so they have connections with each other. ERCOT in Texas is basically cut off. It has almost no connections with other grids. And so it is an island unto itself. It covers about 80% of Texas and includes about 90% of the population. It's not all of Texas, but it is most of it. So ERCOT oversees the grid. It doesn't own any of the assets. It doesn't own any of the generation or transmission or the utilities, but it oversees it. It was simply, it wasn't caught by surprise. It was just utterly overwhelmed by events. This storm was extremely powerful, and ERCOT had plans on the books. It had models about how cold they think it would be and how much power generation would be used. Those plans, they didn't predict the scale of the cold weather, but more to the point, they didn't predict how many generation units would go out. Generation units started disappearing very fast. The Texas grid is heavily dependent on gas. It's more than 50% gas, has a lot of wind power, has a little bit of nuclear power, some coal power, small bit of solar and other, but heavily dependent on gas. All of these resources suffered. Basically, none of them had been weatherized. We had a big storm about 2011 we had the same problem. It was a much smaller storm and a much shorter storm, but the cold weather knocked generation units out in 2011, and there were rolling blackouts then too. The federal government, FERC, wrote a report detailing this in 300 pages and explaining that everything should be weatherized to prevent this. It was just a recommendation, it was not an order. Texas is based, the Texas grid is based on a market system. ERCOT, which answers to the Public Utility Commission, has a fairly light regulatory hand. It doesn't force any of the generators to do this, to weatherize their systems, and they were all utterly unprepared. Every type of power system, gas, wind, coal, nuclear, they all suffered. At least 40% of the grid went down. And so at the time when power use was spiking, because everyone was trying to stay warm, all these generation resources just disappeared. Further, the gas system was a disaster. Gas, when it's pulled out of the ground, has water in it that needs to be separated before it can be sent into pipelines. Those systems started freezing. That cut off the gas supply to the power plants. The power plants went out. You had another reverse effect where then the gas fields could no longer get power, and they started going offline, increasing the problem. People were losing gas and power in their homes. Their homes started freezing up. Pipes burst. That started draining the water system. At the same time, water treatment plants were losing power. And so people were hit by this synergistic effect of losing power, water, and gas very, very fast as one played into the other.
Thank you. And Bill, I know I asked a big question of you. Thank you so much for focusing it down for us. Any of our other panelists want to share thoughts? And I did see, Rain, actually, you had a good question. So as a panelist, let's just have sort of a conversation amongst our panelists.
Okay, yeah, sure. So my question is wondering how old were the models that they were using, because I was curious as to what predictions they were making for the temperature and if it was accounting for climate chaos or not. Like, how old are these models?
ERCOT updates their models regularly. Very often, I don't have a good sense as to what
extremes they
in terms of anticipating climate change. I don't. They update their models, but it's the nature of the industry. It's backwards. You estimate future events based on your worst case past events.
Right, exactly. We have the same issue right now with flooding issues right along the coast, because all flood insurance, everything that people assume is safe for them in these areas are based off really old models. And so when something bad happens, not only do people not anticipate it, but they'll waive a lot of the regulations in the aftermath in order to allow people to rebuild. They'll make even though the regulations in the near future are going to say, for example, require you to raise your house in order to ensure that you're good for the next major storm surge or sea level rise, they'll just waive it. And so, because it's an emergency situation, which I think is kind of crazy also.
Thanks for that, a profoundly important addition into the conversation, and to remind us that this is not just, oh, winter storms are coming. Let's remember, according to the model, y'all, it's pretty clear this is going to start happening more and more in Texas because of climate change. And what we're talking about is higher sweltering heat, more 100-day plus summer days, and because climate change is disrupting the Gulf Stream, more bitter winters and longer winter storms. An incredibly important point. Zach also makes me think, Zach, about Corpus Christi and how I know so much rebuilding happened that absolutely should not have been rebuilt after Harvey. So I wonder if I could entice you to share a little bit from the Corpus perspective.
Yes, definitely. I mean, one thing that stuck out to me the most about this was that a lot of the power shutoffs were they were decided. It was forced upon us. So AEP in Corpus Christi was the one that sort of governs energy allotment for our city, and they put out a release saying, you know, it's not that our infrastructure is going down. It's not like our power lines are going down like it did during Harvey. It's we've been told to not give you power. And the thing that's so illuminating about that to me is that we have, you know, some people experiencing blackouts and some people not. And so like those pictures that you saw of Austin and Houston, where the downtown is brilliantly lit up, whereas the neighborhood just outside of it is entirely dark. In Corpus Christi, the industries didn't lose any power. The industry was kept online for the power. It was the people at home that had their power shut off. And then because, you know, we're not weatherized for long-term freezing, people in unregulated housing that are renting, their houses are just like shanties put up. And so all of the pipes burst. And so the loss of power shut down all of our water grid as well. The city actually had water mains burst because of it, and because they didn't have power, weren't able to isolate where the main bursts were to get the water back online. And so then we had a water boil for 4 days because there was the potential for contamination, and the city couldn't even fix it because they weren't getting the power they needed to run the diagnostic tools. Meanwhile, industry, the fossil fuel refineries that are lining Nueces River are still running online, just like, even though they're the ones that, you know, have been driving climate change for the last 50 years knowingly. So it's just, it's frustrating because we're like, the people are the ones paying the price for all of these changes. And yet, you know, those in power, those with capital, those that run this are largely unaffected because of their influence.
Thank you so much for bringing that point in, and sort of like, if there was any question about it, the role that capitalism and the dictates of capital play in this, Zach has just made crystal clear. We got a couple of questions coming in. I want to turn to you, Marc, because I know you to be an artist and culture worker. You know, Bill laid down like something pretty complex and boiled it down, but I'm going to actually ask you, does the artist and culture worker have a special role to play in explaining these kinds of things to people? And if so, have you thought about like how to do that?
No, I've considered, I actually wrote some haikus about it. I wish I would have thought to print those out and read them to you. But how to convey that to the people, I don't know if that's really the role of the artist. I mean, art can't be made to do that. But I think at this point, how do we protect ourselves against like corruption at high levels like we just experienced? Like, should we form a network of, whenever something goes down, the people kind of automatically know what's going to happen as far as where to get supplies, you know, where to get water, you know, stuff like that. That's the type of information I would like to convey. I don't know what to do about at this time because this happened just last week. So I haven't had really enough time to, what art can be made out of that, but definitely communication needs to be made. What kind of pressure can we put on, like who to put pressure on, like so this never happens again? Because that seems to be an ongoing pattern just in Houston. I don't know about the rest of Texas, but the philosophy about waiting till the catastrophe happens to possibly maybe kind of sort of deal with it or just roll it over to the next person in charge. That's been the problem in Houston. But I don't know about Dallas, San Antonio, Austin, those areas, how they're coping with that sort of philosophy. Because I can bring up other you know, Harvey, like the flooding issues that we have that have never been rectified. We just continue to build more stuff and put concrete on the ground. You know, the pandemic, we were slow to operate, you know, to do the whole lockdown thing. You know, and now it's just like an ongoing thing. That's what I would probably talk about. When is this going to change? You know, there's other things I could, you know, bring up about that type of mentality and people in power. But why hog the mic?
Well, you got the mic if you want to keep going.
So we also have, I mean, I don't want to steer from what we're talking about, you know, which is the freeze last week, but, you know, we also have the big Highway 45 expansion, which is going to destabilize a Black neighborhood, Independence Heights, historic Black neighborhood in Houston, without any care. There's not a lot of press about it. A lot of people, those people are going to lose their homes due to eminent domain. We don't need any more freeways. You know, we're like freeway central at this point. It's like so many freeways and toll roads now. It's like at the cost of homes, you know, at the cost of quality of life in Houston. So bringing that back to what we're talking about, is really like a very strong, flawed capitalistic structure that needs to be addressed. It's like a kind of like a statewide sort of level of arrogance that needs to be addressed. You know, it's bigger than just last week. This is like an ongoing problem that seems to be like this big concrete and money eating monster. You know, it doesn't really help the regular people, but it helps a few very, very rich and powerful people.
Thank you, Mark. And also I want to thank Ben Mansky for demonstrating what in my organizing culture at Cooperation Humboldt, we say children are always welcome at every Cooperation Humboldt event or meeting, because we believe in building intergenerational space. So thank you, Ben, and your assistant, or maybe you're assisting your colleague there. I'm not sure which is happening. So thank you so much for that. I do want to give Alice a chance to sort of weigh in on this, if you've got any thoughts on the big picture question.
Yeah, I want to touch on a really good point that Zach brought up earlier, which is pointing to the fact that none of this was natural, right? Like in disaster recovery, I think something that's very apparent is that there is no such thing as a natural disaster. This was a climate disaster, but the blackouts, the deaths, the intense, both physical and emotional trauma that resulted from this crisis, that's all a result of choices that humans, governments, and corporations have made. And the example that Zach gave of, you know, them controlling the intentional blackouts, right? Like controlling who to cut power from. I think that's just that's only the most visible example of the deliberate choices that are happening. To tie this back to Hurricane Harvey, you know, a lot of people, I think, tried to frame the hurricane and the flooding that resulted as some sort of equalizer. And there's this language of disasters as being equalizing that's thrown around a lot, but no part of it was equalizing, right? Like the weight of these disasters, they fall on the same communities, the same neighborhoods, the same populations over and over again. The entirety of Houston's physical landscape, right? Our bayous, the dams, those are all very intentionally constructed to protect the high income, wealthy downtown areas at the expense of many of these other, many other less well-off parts of Houston that are again and again thrown under the bus. So yeah, I think also tying on to something that all of the other panelists have said so far is that disaster is absolutely a state of normal. It's a normal state for these communities. It's not just that disasters are stacking on top of each other over and over again, but that, you know, instead of being a deviation from normal, what disasters do is just make visible all of these violences and harms and injustices that are always happening in our society that's fueled by these forces of capitalism. It's just that there are periods of time when it's less visible and there's less national attention on it, but it's always happening. And it's very place-based.
Thank you for that, Alice. Let's kick it to Cristian in Dallas.
Hi, I wanted to add on to what Alice was saying. Working class people, poor people, Black, Indigenous, Latinx, people of color, they face disasters every single day in their life. And when something like this happens, they're the first to get hit. and they're the hardest to get hit, which is why like they usually lose their life or something happens. They're a paycheck away or something less away from ending up on the streets. And today I did a food distribution earlier this morning with some community organizations, and we were told that we were not going to receive 3,000 boxes of food because they didn't have milk in there. So we weren't going to get the rest of the food. And so many people were already lined up. We had bags of stuff that we had already sorted, but it was not enough. And people were coming up to us ready to take that stuff. And I had to tell people, like, go back to your cars. And I had to tell people that we can only give one bag per car. Even if you're multiple families, like, we can only give one bag per car. And I realized it's only going to get worse. And we know climate change is here. It's not 5 or 10 years away from now. Summers are getting hotter, winters are getting way colder. Within a week, it was 10 degrees outside, less, and now Monday it was 74, 75, which is insane. And so I think that you have to organize in your own communities, in Houston and Austin, in Texas, wherever. I'm doing it here in Dallas with all these community-based organizations, people who care, people who will show up because they don't ask you to, they don't pay you to. You show up because you know what it's like, right? And so when this winter storm came, I didn't have power, but I didn't freak out because I knew that I had people that I could talk to, people that I knew that had resources that if I needed, they would help me. And I think that we know this stuff is coming. So start talking to people, start getting on the ground, start organizing in every group that you can, because no one's going to help you. You have to help yourself. And if you want to see change, you have to be that change, because no one's going to do it for you.
Thank you, Cristian. And of course, we're all in it together, right? So we have to help ourselves, help each other, right? I know that was implicit in what you said. I just really want to lift that part up because as a, Texan born and bred, like that culture of rugged individualism gets built into it. And what I got to say is, y'all, we need each other, right? And we all know that because every one of our panelists has literally demonstrated that. I also want to lift up Brian Gibbons, who in the chat, for those of you who aren't following it, just, it's not a question, but a very astute observation that I want to say out loud on the program. He quoted progressive era Mayor Tom Johnson of Cleveland, Ohio, who believed that privately owned utilities were bastions of privilege that would destroy democracy if not controlled. He said, quote, "I believe in municipal ownership of waterworks, of parks, of schools. I believe in the municipal ownership of these monopolies because if you do not own them, they in turn will own you. They will rule your politics, corrupt your institutions, and finally destroy your liberties." End quote. And what I really appreciate that, folks, is it's including your liberties. And again, wearing my hat as a fellow and board member of the Liberty Tree Foundation for the Democratic Revolution, like, we understand that liberty and personal liberty has got to actually be part of our struggle for collective liberation and collective ownership. So thank you, Brian, for that point. And I do want to actually, because many of us have literally brought us into this, but what is to be done? And it's, every one of our panelists either began to answer that or even started to answer it. But I'm just going to literally ask our panelists to go around. In your estimation, with the hat tip to Lenin, Vlad, not John, what is to be done? I saw you grin, Alice, so therefore you have to go first.
Damn, my facial expressions are always getting me in trouble. I mean, it's a huge question. I guess I'm just gonna touch on some, I guess, like contradictions that I've been thinking about in the solutions that are proposed. So, I mean, bottom line, like, the energy system needs to be regulated. And Bill, I'm not a policy expert, so you can fact check me on some of these things. But there's a lot of people that are specifically, I think, framing this crisis and the blackouts as just a problem for Texas, right? Like, oh, this is an example, like they're pointing fingers at Republican leadership and at ERCOT. And that's true. But even like if you're in New York, right, and your power system is regulated, you're a part of this bigger grid network, like that doesn't mean that you're not a part of this broader global system of neoliberalization and privatization, right? The thing about being in Texas and in Houston specifically, the power and energy resources that flow through this city and this state go to the entire rest of the country and the rest of the world. And there are these very powerful global forces that are promoting deregulation and neoliberalization, privatization of energy systems and grid systems. Like an example of this is after Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico in 2017. And I mean, you know, there was like Tesla moving in. It was like the Wild West almost. Like Tesla was basically using this this land as just an experimentation. And there are people who I think basically this disaster led to kind of the opposite of what we're experiencing in Texas, but the disaster led to the privatization. So I guess just remembering that a lot of the root causes that led to this huge crisis in Texas, it's not isolated to this state, and that they do require an international perspective and a global perspective.
Thank you, Alice, for picking up that. I know I asked a hard and broad and yet deep question, and thank you for picking that up. Other panelists?
Sure. Actually, I wanted to touch on what Alice said, and I also want to shout out West Street Recovery because I love you guys so hard, so hard. And I just also want to shout out that if y'all want to donate to West Street Recovery directly right now, you totally should. We are always down to support them, but you guys should totally do because they are doing great work with like plumbing and housing right now, and that's really high-end stuff that's really difficult to do. That's kind of the stuff I focus on in mutual aid. It's like the rebuilding and construction. It's usually way more expensive, and hand warmers are great, but a house that keeps you warm is better. So please donate to them while they're doing this great work. Thanks. So I wanted to touch on the Puerto Rico part and also kind of like the what needs to be done. So I went to Puerto Rico as part of the installation for some of the solar down there, and like kind of having these discussions with folks on the ground. Somebody brought up a question about microgrids. And I'd be curious to know like what the statistics were for that. I think somebody's like doing a lot of fact checking, so please feel free to share what the comparative data was. But one of the issues with Puerto Rico was that they, like many other countries that have fallen prey to the World Bank and IMF, think globalization and all of the different trade agreements that we've had since the 90s. Because of that, we've developed, and you can look into, if I'm sure people are familiar with it, but if not, you can look into the different clauses that have basically taken away the liberty of democratized or even otherwise countries to be able to create policies and regulations for their own people in their own countries, and corporations are able to then sue them for not having made the profit that they were anticipated to have made when they had these contracts. Additionally, when they get too into debt, then they'll come up with these loans. And if they can't come up with these loans, it's an excuse to privatize all of the public resources. And that happens with energy, and that happens with water. And in Puerto Rico, the debt, which is obviously not their fault and has to do with all of the different regulations that we've had against them for trade in the last few years and the different tax systems, led to the cause that they needed to justify the privatization. And I think building a really good understanding of the difference between a privatized and a public or municipal system for things like water, which is going to be the next one, immediately the next one, and energy are so critical. Having that understanding so that you don't fall prey as a community, or even just aren't being told about it, don't notice the signs of what's happening around that start to show that privatization happening, then it ends up with people kind of being hoodwinked, if you will, at the end, and not understanding what happened until the very end. And I'm wondering right now if, because of the size of the country as is, which I think is why mutual aid groups are so important. We've lost a greater understanding of what's happening to everyone. And I think that's why network to mutual aid is so important, because we have those conversations and start to see where those commonalities are. And we start to put together the pieces of how jacked it is that nobody's actually coming to support, yet we're giving everybody all this money to come support, i.e. taxes. And so if we're just there to help each other and the systems are not there to support us, and that has failed over and over again, but they keep finding excuses to put us further into oppression and debt, so that we are then justified into privatization, which is going to be the only thing that saves us, capitalism, etc. This is all the justification. And if we do not learn the skills to build our own society the way that we want to see it, and build those networks within our community and then within the nodes that are beyond us, like we did during a lot of the different hurricanes recently, especially with Lake Charles, we had a really nice network going on between Louisiana of just different nodes that were able to do and pass things along. And so I think what needs to be done, in short, is a lot of education around some of the globalization trade agreements and things like that, that are kind of the players behind the scenes navigating these great deals that people find out about at, all of a sudden when a bad storm happens or a blackout happens, like what happened a few years ago on the West Coast as well. I think that education is critical. And I think the ability to understand what is in your own community as a resource, like who has the skills, who has a space, where are the safe spaces, who has a tree that grows oranges, like literally everything that you can figure out, because there's lots of people with fruit trees that have too much fruit and it's a great source, like literally every source in your community. Find it, know about it, network it, map it, share it, continue to do that until you build those relationships. Get out on the street, don't just be on Facebook, get out in the street and meet the people and work with the people. Like, 6 feet away for now, but you feel me. So what needs to be done is community relationships, and then also trust. I say that because I think someone said in the same sentence about how we have to be there for each other, but then also we're totally alone, which is totally true. And that's how we feel, but also kind of a contradiction in a way. And I think that trust, right? We trust our own community, and then we're suspicious. And I say we, and I know I'm kind of saying a general statement, so I'll just say me, but in my experience, right? And so how do we build that trust? How do we break down those barriers? And I think getting in the street, doing mutual aid, especially after a disaster, when there's a big vacuum of power, if you can find those relationships, then it's so critical, because you can build those relationships and a sense of solidarity and power together to push back against those systems that come in and are like, oh no, we're the only way to save you, and you have to give up this and this in order for us to save you. So build the power in order to be able to resist. Build the knowledge and build the capacity to be able to resist and build. That is all.
So thank you so much, Rain, for that. Questions are coming in, and that's great. I'm going to give our panelists that haven't shared on this notion the space before we go directly to those questions, but we will go to questions, and I'll try to go a little more rapid fire. But what I will encourage our panelists is to think about what can we do in terms of our individual networks, but how do we translate that into political power? Maybe it can include electoral political power. It doesn't have to be directly electoral power, but how do we build collective power to change the policy? So I want to invite Marc, Cristian, Bill, Zach to touch on that in the what is to be done.
Definitely repeat that something needs to be done. Using our platforms to express our voices, to encourage people to galvanize, because many people are going to have ideas that I'm not going to have. I definitely agree with the speaker that just spoke about having our own networks among ourselves on the street level, as far as even just something as self-preservation. You can get some local politicians involved that have a voice. We have local politicians that actually do care, that get involved in at the street level. Whenever there's donations, whenever there's something whenever there needs to be a PR presence, they do lend that that energy to what's happening on the street level. So I think once you have a big enough strong force on the street level, self-preservation, and even being very vocal about we're kind of fed up, that can spill over to, galvanize other people to get involved, and it kind of expands the pebble in the river. As far as like how to combat big corporations, that I don't know yet, but I definitely believe that in, there's power in people. Like there's power in enough people getting behind the fact that this needs to change, that it can change. That's what I have to say.
Thank you, Mark. Zach?
Yeah, I definitely want to second everything that everyone has been said. Rain's analysis of the importance of mutual aid group was impeccable and brilliant. And like what Alice was saying, grounding it in sort of an internationalist approach, seeing how all of these are overlapping catastrophes that we're facing. Yeah, with our mutual aid group, we've noticed over this last year, like it can only do so much. I mean, we're really just band-aids, and so using like what Rain was saying, using the work to make those connections with the community to then build sort of lateral power to then approach sort of solutions on every level has been sort of our recent approach, being like, we're building these relationships with these people, we're building trust within our communities, and then we can use that trust, that sort of contact that we're making with the people to then have conversations about, like what we're doing now, what is to be done, so that we can then introduce policies on the city and state level to, to prevent these catastrophes from being so severe. I think something that Cristian said in his intro that said, where he said that like the work that these mutual aid groups are doing is beautiful, but it's like bittersweet because it's paired with the fact that the people that actually have the power to make change and to bring relief are doing nothing. And so we're using our mutual aid group to build sort of that fury against sort of these so-called elected officials to help politicize people, to help get people involved in a democratic process so that we can then build true like workers and people's power to restructure the way our governments work. So here in Corpus, we're using that to like put pressure on the government to build low barrier shelters for our houseless neighbors that were disproportionately affected by this storm. We're using it to put pressure on the city to amend the charter to not build saltwater desalination plant so that they can use all that water for industry to make more fossil fuel. Using our connections to get people on board for all of these sort of broad policy decisions is the way that we're going forward, because there's only so much that we can do to take care of each other when there's all these people that have the capacity to end all of this suffering who choose not to. And so using the networks to fully galvanize everybody, I think that's what needs to be done, and that's what we're trying to do here in Corpus.
So folks, I'm doing my best to try to make sure that we share the mic with these brilliant panelists and bring you in. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to kick it to Cristian, then to Bill for the what is to be done. Then I'm going to invite Joe to harvest, say, 3 questions at once that he's been following from Facebook and also the chat. So 3 at once. And to the panelists, I'll ask you to be listening to those and think about which one of those you might want to take on. So let's go Cristian, Bill, then Joe.
So yes to everything that everyone has said. Almost like creating a world within a world, people that you trust, people that you know. And then I'll speak a little bit about what's happening here in Dallas. Right now, Sunrise Dallas is working with a coalition of other groups, such as Texas Organizing Project, Working Families Party, Mi Familia Vota, union groups like Workers Defense. We're creating a coalition because this May is the Dallas City Council elections. And while you can also create your own world within a world, it's also good to like change the rules from within as well. So we're all working together to get behind districts and candidates or actually even putting our own candidates. I myself was considering running for my district here in Oak Cliff within Dallas, but I'm working with a past person and he's gonna run and we're helping his campaign. There's also some other community leaders for community organizations. They're running as well, because it's really hard to have hope in people who don't live this, who don't show up, or who only show up for a picture and a photo op, which is very disheartening. So we're putting ourselves in power, and we're working together and doing this with groups the progressive groups, which can be, progressive is a weird word, but progressive groups who care and who want to change and who show up. And so I would recommend start doing that in your own cities. Once we have councils that we can trust, mayors that we can trust, we work together as a state and change this whole state.
Right on. Let's go, Bill, then Joe.
Thanks, David. Yeah, I tend to agree with a lot of what everyone has said. There's a lot of different levels that people can act on. I mean, there are technical fixes to everything that went wrong in ERCOT, but this has shown that the market design doesn't work, assuming that companies will regulate themselves and that high prices will incentivize them to do everything right, has utterly failed. This has been a 20-year market design in Texas, and it's been a disaster. There's going to be a lot of pressure in Texas to put all the blame on ERCOT, which is a single entity, a corporation, in fact. That misses the focus. This is political organizing is the only thing that can get meaningful change. And I think now is absolutely a moment for it. I think there's been a substantial loss in any faith in the current system by a lot of people. I mean, people who are hard to convince that there are issues were freezing in their house for a week, and they get it now. And there is a real chance to reach out to a very broad number of people and shift the political balance very fast.
Thank you to all of the panelists for taking on that incredibly important and challenging question. And I'll just so here's what I figured out is we're all in it together. We're going to have to do the work where we live, work, play, and pray. Those folks who are our neighbors, we need to actually do that work. And we've got to start connecting nodes in a rhizomic fashion. We're actually creating value-laden supply chains to actually get our needs met. And I'm just going to zero in on Cristian. Ultimately, y'all, Texas got to take over Texas. We've got to actually become the government and actually act like democracy is a thing, even though it's not. Joe, can you give us 3 good questions or harvest it from 3
David,
people?
I'd be happy to. And as always on Shelter and Solidarity, by the time we get 45 minutes to an hour in, we call on our live Zoom audience, our Facebook participants to join the conversation. And so we're going to bring in 3 questions right now. One I've been asked to relay from Comrade Ben Mansky, a regular on the show. Ben asks, what is organized labor doing in Texas right now that we know of in relationship to this crisis? So that's question number 1, question cluster number 1. Second question, building on that from yours truly, I'd like to ask about where the state, meaning both the Texas state government, but also the federal government fits in here. It's been very clear from the presentation so far that folks don't put a lot of faith in much of the existing leadership. Nonetheless, I'd like to push on the question of what demands are being raised right now at either the state or the federal level or the municipal level for that matter, that you think should be supported, or new demands that are not really mass demands yet that should be pushed. Maybe we could spotlight some of those calls that are out there, even if it's the exception to the rule. I understand Biden's supposed to be making a trip down to Texas by the end of the week. I'm curious what kind of greeting you think he should have. And the third question, I'd like to go to our newest co-producer of Shelter and Solidarity, Rachel Patton, to relay it herself. Rachel, can you unmute and let's hear you.
Hey everyone, thank you so much. I was wondering, so these crises sort of provide a really good opportunity to organize people as they see how these climate crises are affecting them. And I'm wondering how we can organize people before it becomes so immediate and so grave, and to organize to prevent these kinds of disasters before they become disasters, and how we can sort of reach people who maybe don't realize that these things are going to affect all of us very soon.
Thanks, Rachel. Back to you, David, and to the panel.
Well, fantastic. And thank you, Joe, for that help. So we've got organized labor. We've got a challenge of thinking about the state, both the state of Texas and the state broadly. And then Rachel's question around organizing people in preparation of this. So I'm going to just kick it to the panel, and y'all don't make me call on you this time. So panelists, like pick one of those and let's hear your thoughts. Cristian, I'm going to ask you to dig in a little deeper on organized labor because I literally heard you reference that a little bit. I'm going to ask you to tease that one out. And the rest of the panelists, I will call on you if you make me. So, Cristian, you got it.
So David actually can't speak too much about organized labor. I just know that the workers union Worker Defense is working with us on a coalition. We're building our own platform policy. We'll have that coming out soon. It's called DFW for All. And so each group specializes in their own section and they write policy based on what they believe is most fair. We all have a chance to go through it and see and make edits. But I actually want to talk about Rachel's question, organizing people. I actually first started organizing and met everyone that I know because of the Black Lives Matter protests last year in 2020. At first, I thought like we marched for hours and hours during those summers, and it was really hot and it was terrible. But we all cared and we all showed up every single time. And those are the people that kept on showing up. And those are the people that lead community organizations. And those are the people that helped this past week. So anytime that there's something going on, there's a mass of people, there's people that show up, it's because they care. And they're there they may show up for something, but they're actually there for a lot more. I would hate to say it, but at disaster, there's always opportunity. And take those opportunities and organize with who you can and with what you have and just continue to grow because organizing will never stop.
That ought to be a t-shirt right there. Other panelists want to weigh in on that crop of 3 questions? Go, Alice.
Okay, sorry, Mark.
We're going to go to Mark next.
This is going to be a pretty short answer, but just to touch on the organized labor question, and maybe someone in other factions of organized labor, if you're on this Zoom, you can weigh in. But before I worked for West Street, I was actually working for the Gulf Coast AFL-CIO, which is honestly, I mean, I think I left that space pretty intentionally. Basically, I don't have a very positive outlook on the future of organized labor in Texas, particularly in the traditional channels of like the AFL-CIO and its affiliated unions. At least in Houston, I know that we ideally, we would actually be pushing for progressive policies, things like the Green New Deal, but a lot of our coalition's priorities are determined by, honestly, like white, wealthy unions like the building trades. And so a very big question that was always in my mind when I worked there is like, how can we get the labor movement to actually be a movement again? Because it felt very stagnant when I was there. And how can we sort of build a new coalition of that genuinely represents the interests of working class people and poor people, and that even goes beyond the traditional organizing tool of trade unions, which in my opinion feels like they're kind of operating in our political system currently as an interest party instead of truly a progressive coalition. But I welcome diverging opinions from that.
Mark.
I cannot speak on the labor unions at all. And actually, I was trying to chime in to see if you could reiterate the 3 topics you wanted us to speak on.
Well, in essence, Mark, we had a question on organized labor. We had a broad question on the role of the state, both the state of Texas, but also conceptually the state as understood in political theory, and then a question specifically on organizing people in advance of the disasters, just as a concept.
David,
That's how.
The third one, I would definitely, I could get behind as far as like organizing people, in advance, like preparedness, because we already know there's going to be another disaster. Like we get them like every couple of years. There's always something else. So why not make it like a commonplace thing for the average person to know what to do if this situation occurs, what to do if that situation occurs. I think that's the type of information that people need to really start embracing. Like me, I didn't really have really lot of problems. Last was naturally prepared for a lot of stuff. Like I always have like a gang of reverse osmosis water. I'm probably gonna get some rain barrels pretty soon, invest in that. I always have like, just like the average person should know how to, like, let's say all the grocery stores stop, how do you grow food? That should be like commonplace information. Because I don't believe in the top down anymore. Like, I just think they're going to do what they're going to do. So I'm always like, what can we do on the ground for ourselves? So, we can protect ourselves in any type of situation. Even like on our own block, like if everybody on the block just knew, like, know who has the generators, who's going to, who has room to take a neighbor in if their electricity goes off. Cause I was feeling bad that I wasn't prepared like that. Like now, afterwards, I was like, okay, how many people can I take in the next catastrophe happens? Like where can they stay? What part of my house can they be in? Stuff like that. And that's what I could do personally. So I think if more people had that type of philosophy, if they do have room, instead of like having a lot of, miscellaneous stuff or whatever, they could, be able to take people in just in their own vicinity, their own friends, that would minimize a lot of angst, just preparedness.
Thank you, Mark. And thank you all. So Joe clarified his question around the state was what demands to make of the state, right? Like, and I think that that's an important one. And I'll just sort of, as the moderator, jump in and say, Naomi Klein, I think, did us a great service in the shock doctrine when she talked about the problem with disaster capitalism and said what was coming. So I wonder out loud, y'all, why don't we just reverse engineer that and do disaster socialism? Why don't we actually say we are literally prefiguring the mutual aid that is already happening, the kind of things that Rain talks about, like just tracking the ecosystem of where are fruit trees, what Mark talked about, where are the generators? What if we actually said and ran at the local level in electoral politics, unabashedly saying, I'm running for office because I'm a community prepper. I'm a prepper, but instead of hoarding guns and hoarding food and keeping it for myself and my family and training those guns on other people, my whole agenda is to prepare this community for the disasters that are coming, and we're all going to all take it together. Like, it just feels to me like there must be a way to do electoral politics as an unabashed, radical, revolutionary, and do it authentically. And at the very least, just think of electoral politics as yet one more front of struggle. So that's how I think about Joe's question, but I welcome other panelists to weigh in.
Hey, this is Jane. I just wanted to kind of touch on that third part. Kent just put something in the chat too about Neighborhood Resiliency Hub. So there's been a lot of different movements around urban sustainability, permaculture movement, eco-villages, things like that. And there's going to be a lot of different suggestions about how to like organize those resources within urban areas or rural areas. But I think a lot of what needs to be done as far as being able to navigate and adapt to something that is unpredictable is that you have to diversify. So you can't, just monocrop. You have to have a variety of sources of where you're getting your water. You have to have a variety of sources of where you're getting your energy. You have to have a variety of sources of where the food is located and how it's being produced, or else you are not adaptable and you will not survive something that is unpredictable. So I think a lot of that organizing in advance is really about starting to diversify and map. If you don't have it in your community yet, if you can't find it, build it. If it does not exist yet, and you know it needs to be there, build it now, right? And then when people start seeing you do that, they're going to follow, because unfortunately, you know, that's the way that things are. Some people need an initiative, or uncomfortable, or they need a training and they want to do it, but they don't have the skills. There's like a lot of reasons people hold themselves back, right? Sometimes. And so another thing that I think is really great is things like free schools. I used to do free schools all the time. They're great, and anybody with any kind of knowledge can just host one, and then everybody gets to learn. You can host a training if you know how to like change the oil in a car. Great, teach like a whole bunch of people how to change the oil in a car, save them like 20 to 30 bucks the next time. Whatever needs to happen, that still helps the community in some way, especially for folks like they just didn't have the access to the knowledge. And on as far as being able to make sure we organize, I really want to just bring attention to a lot of those communities that are not considered. Thinking about, folks who have mental wellness issues, or folks that are houseless, or immigrant populations, or anybody out there like that. It's really important to think about like those needs in advance, because those are the people who don't have the privilege to access some of the resources that will be provided. And so it's really, 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 really critical to think about how do we make sure that those individuals are also getting that same level of solidarity that we're trying to have with everyone else. And part of that, I think, is also, like I keep saying, and everyone else has too, is get out in the community. You got to get on the street. You got to know who the people are. You got to talk to them and know what their needs are, or else you're doing the same white savior thing when you go out into the street and you just bring a bunch of stuff. You know what I'm saying? Like, you got to know your community. So getting out in the street, knowing the community, building that network. I just think that builds the trust that you need to feel like you're empowered as a group enough to stand against something. And that standing against something is literally
Stepping up for Texas.
Say that again. Oh, maybe not. But yeah, it's that power together that lets us be able to feel like we can stand up, I think. And I think that's going to be critical, because fear is what they use. Fear is what they use to get us, and knowledge is power, right? So build the knowledge, build the awareness of where the stuff is, and then people aren't going to be as fearful. They feel a little bit more prepared, even if they just know how to change a tire, a little bit more prepared. And so as we start to build that, we feel empowered, and I think that just spreads. And I don't know how to make people care. To answer one of the other things I think Rachel brought up is like, how do you make people care? Oh my God, I think if any of us had the answer to that, that'd be great. But I think what I see when I'm on the ground after a disaster situation is that people lose a lot of the animosity or prejudices or stuff, whatever the drama is that we have between ourselves, because people see the need, and it's just like this pull. And so, but that's immediate, right? You got like a week or two before everybody starts, having issues with why it's not getting back to normal yet and starting to freak out. But if you can hit that sweet spot, and you can get people to start building together, I think we have that capacity. I think we have the ability to stand up together, and I think we have the ability to make a new world. But we're going to have to diversify. We're going to have to start taking more ownership and autonomy, and not being so reliant on these centralized and monoculture type systems, these global trade systems where we have no idea what the bottom line is. We have no idea what the minimum number of resources are that we still have available to ourselves as a planet. Like, tell me how much water is in your aquifer right now, especially Texas. Tell me how much water is in your aquifer right now. Okay, because if you don't know how much water you have left, I should probably be careful about how much you're using, right? But that's the world that we live in. We are completely removed from those resources. So make it smaller, less centralized, so that you're aware and you can self-govern. You can collectively self-govern your own resources. I'm gonna be quiet and step back now, but I just wanted to touch on that, Rachel, because I was like, when you said, how do we make people care? I was like, so I feel you.
So I'm going to kick it to Joe, who has a follow-up and also has captured another question or two. Joe?
Yeah, absolutely. No, thanks for this very, I think rich discussion. As the host of the regular Shelter in Solidarity, I cannot resist this moment to mention that we have another show tomorrow night, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard, on a very relevant topic: the challenges and the value of left and progressive media in this crisis moment, not only the crisis of COVID, but the crisis of capitalism. Obviously, it goes without saying that amplifying the stories, the struggles, the lessons that are being learned to people who haven't heard them yet is a crucial part of the struggle. So that's same Zoom place, slightly different Zoom time, 7 p.m., 1 hour later. And we'd love to have some of you back. I know we all have obligations, but this has been a great conversation, and this is not signaling the end of it, but I wanted to make sure before you go, we'll be back here tomorrow and twice a month for the foreseeable on Thursday nights, usually, plus bonus episodes like this one. Okay, so we have a question, which I think builds on some that's been said from Pine. Pine asked me to read this question. The question is in the chat box. You may have to scroll a bit for it, but it goes like this. How do we think mutual aid groups that become active in response to this disaster should continue to develop and grow once it's over? And to that, I would just like to tack on another, maybe a little more focused question or a more specific question about the bills. I mean, are there opportunities for organizing right now about these egregious bills that people are coming? I mean, the heat may be back on. There may be, some power back on for lots of folks. But we're talking about people with these $16,000, electricity bills, the quote lucky ones that still had electricity in some cases. I wondered, I'd actually be interested in the analysis of that from Bill and others, but also the political organizing opportunity. So again, from Pine, a broader question about how to keep people active, or how should the kind of organizing, or how could and should the organizing coming out of this immediate disaster become something else more long-term? And then a question about, the specific issues of opportunities around the question of who's going to pay. Thanks.
Well, Bill, you were specifically identified as a panelist, so would you like to take a cut at that?
Sure, I got called out. I think that's an excellent point. I think the question of who is going to pay is huge. And there's a lot to organize on. The bills are important, and they're a story everyone gets immediately, and they get the unfairness of it. Realize that most people will not see these massively spiked bills. Most people are on, on a set rate, and the way it'll impact them is in several ways. One is that, in the next few months, their utility will add a cost recovery fee and add 2 cents a kilowatt hour for the next 2 years to pay it. So they'll pay for it. They just won't see it in the same way. They'll also see their taxes go up, probably in cities that have their own utility systems. They are all hurting. I know several of them just got hammered trying to pay the cost when the price of electricity shot up 300 times on the spot market, and the gas price did the same thing. And so these cities are going to raise taxes for that likely, and the quality of the system may well get worse as they divert funds away from system repairs just to try to pay off these massive bills. So I think those bills are a great organizing tool and point out the unfairness of it. I think an insane number of people, though, tens of millions, lost power, water, gas, what have you. And I think that is equally shocking, just getting to the heart of the system, just how unfair it is and how untrustworthy it is. Texas, I don't know of anyone making demands on the state government, partially because this is so sudden and because nobody has any faith in the state government to do much of anything. But I think there's always been in Texas a push that as long as everything is low tax, then they can get away with anything and they're not expected to even have competent government services. I think it's very easy to push back on that now and say this is the result of that low tax ideology where they will just utterly fail you and your family.
Thank you so much. Y'all, I'm going to go Zach, then Alice, then Christian. Zach.
Yeah, I'm really glad that, Rain, your question is being asked, because that's something that my mutual aid working group has been working on over this past year. So we formed in response to the pandemic, and thankfully, with having been active for a year, when this winter storm hit, we had a great capacity to do with it. And so, yes, it is important to keep mutual aid working groups operating, just continuously and endlessly, because the more you operate, the stronger that you become. So when we had first started organizing around the single pandemic issue, that kept us going for a couple months until sort of attention towards our group and the continued delays of any government action led to a decline in our capacity. But through the couple months that we had been working, we had brought in a lot more volunteers and people in our contacts. And so when we hit this point, we were like, well, we have so many people that we can start, like, what do we want to do? What are we able to do? What skills do we have that we can lend to each other? And how can we use that to expand and do other things? And so a lot of the things that Rain brought up about sort of community gardening and resource management and building nodes and stuff like that, like we pivoted and we recognized that a lot of the food that we were sending to people was canned food or not fresh. And so that led us to think about the food infrastructure in our city. And so then we started to develop a community garden program. And so we're building community gardens and we're assisting people who have never gardened before to learn how to grow food in their own backyard. We had people that were teachers, and we knew that a lot of kids were struggling with at-home learning. And so we were like, well, this isn't going to cost money, it's just cost labor. So let's start our own tutoring program. There's just so many things, like you just query all of your members and participants on what skills they have and to build programs around those skills. And the beautiful thing about that is it just becomes this compounding, ever-growing cycle where now you went from one program to multiple programs. You started with 12 people and now there's 24 people, and all of them are doing their own projects within their own communities. And the other beautiful thing about that is sharing skills and labor doesn't cost any money. So when our donations dried up, that didn't mean that we had to end our activity. It meant that we were able to still continually assisting our neighbors and building community without money, with just labor and time and skill and effort and love. And so I think that's one of the best ways that mutual aid groups, I know that everyone else on this call can also add to their own experience with it, but that's just one of the best ways to continue the work of mutual aid and also continue expanding its capacity and envelope so that, eventually it'll replace the inefficient sort of government top-down mode of assistance and replace the nonprofit industrial complex. So yeah, I hope that helps with your question.
Thank you so much. We're going to go to Alice, then Cristian.
Zach, that was an amazing answer. And this is kind of, I don't know if it's pushing back against that a little bit, but I'm friends with one of the people who run the Houston Mutual Aid account. And I just want to plug them because they're incredible. They raised over $250,000. And in 4 days, they distributed like $200K of that in direct cash aid to people. So $100 a family. And that's absolutely incredible. But also, one of those organizers said recently, like, they've also been doing food and water drives, right? But it's like, we can only play government for so long. And I think my interpretation of that is like, why is the responsibility of people receiving basic needs like drinking water falling on the shoulders of like a team of 3 like 20-year-old women? Like, I just think like there's something about the situation that's so absurd. But like, I don't know, I guess I've just been thinking about like, so the role of mutual aid, right, is to fill in the gaps and the failures of government. And if you're distributing cash aid, that's going to reach families so much more quickly than like, the months that it's going to take for a FEMA application to go through. But I don't know, I guess I want to think like, if you take a step back, $200,000 and giving $100 to each family, that's 2,000 families. Houston is a city of 2.3 million people, right? Like the scale of the disaster and the scale of the aid that's happening right now just doesn't fit. And so trying to think about like, I don't know, it's kind of, it's something that I'm stuck on as well. But I think one way that I think it's really important as we move forward, going back to Rain's previous comment, I think focusing on community and thinking about how these forces of globalization, urbanization, and capitalism, right? They've completely broken apart these traditional modes of social organization and connection that happen at a much smaller scale. And so it's very hard to meet the needs of an entire Houston community and make sure that no one's falling through the cracks. Mutual Aid Houston operates primarily on social media. There are so many, undocumented families, people who speak Spanish, don't have reliable internet connection, that just aren't on social media. And so there's a lot of the same people are still going to be falling through those cracks. And so I think it really does go back to decentralization and actually building a real community with deep connections, right? Like Westry operates primarily in Northeast Houston, and we don't just use our community group chats for disasters. We're like, every morning there's someone who messages good morning, and we wish each other like, Merry Christmas and Happy New Year and things like that. So I think like it definitely for me goes back to building those relationships at honestly a much smaller scale than the scale that like these big relief and aid programs are operating on right now.
Cristian?
So I will like, those ideas were amazing. We're pretty much doing that as well. What Zach was saying about community gardens. We work, Latinx Dallas and Sunrise Dallas works with Oak Cliff Veggie Project. They've been doing food distributions for the past 8 years, and we've been helping them for the past year. They have 4 locations around Oak Cliff, which is a small part of Dallas. And we've also started growing our own food at each of the location. It's not a lot, but it's just to get started and just to start getting that process going, because you got to start somewhere. But eventually we would take it further and start selling that to, first for our own people, for our own community. It would be free because you put in the time, you put in the effort. It's a communal thing. And then outside of this community, we would sell that produce, local produce, to whoever wants to buy it at a higher price. It's locally grown. It's usually a BIPOC community. People will pay that price. That's how you can sustain. Unfortunately, we still will need money, but we won't need money from within. We just need money to continue to fund these things. And then when we have our own, when you're growing your own crops, when you're growing your own mushrooms, by the way, I learned how to grow mushrooms during the pandemic, which is your own food. If you can make your own food, you are saving yourself money. And then if you can sell it, you don't have to go work at another place or wherever and provide your own labor or this or that. You're making everything yourself. When you do that, you can then sell that. And then I would even say a lot of our mutual aid groups do primarily run off of Instagram, Twitter, and maybe even Facebook. If there's a way to go viral, people will buy your stuff. People will want to support you, just like they supported the Houston Mutual Aid, $250,000. Continue that. Have your own, I would even hate to say like, have your own merch, anything like that, so that people will buy from you and that you don't have to go anywhere else. Making everything yourself and then selling that. And then within your own communities, your basic necessities are met. You have everything that you need: education, food, housing. It's all there for you. That's just, it's, yeah, if you can go viral, if you can get what you need, people will support you. And that's how you can self-sustain.
Well, folks, this has been a phenomenal conversation, and 90 minutes has just flown by. So what I'm going to do is open the space to each of our panelists for some parting or final thoughts based on everything that we've heard. Joe, just as a heads up, I am going to kick it to you for the final, since I know you are the normal host of this program. So let's open it up to our panelists for final thoughts. Rain.
I was just about to ask if there was a speaking order. Sure. Okay. Thank you guys, everybody. It was really awesome to be here, and I love sharing space with folks who are also working on revolutionary acts. So thank you, everyone, for what you do, and keep doing it. We got to stick strong and together. So everyone's an expert in something, whether you believe yourself or not. Like, figure out what it is that you love to share and share it with the community, and go meet everyone, and do educate yourself about where your resources are coming from quickly, because there will be a grab for privatization on a lot of our public resources. And you can look into how that's already happening in a lot of countries. There's some pretty good documentaries about it that you can find too, especially about the water and energy crises and privatization. So I'd highly recommend that as some of my parting words, and stay safe.
We're going to go Zach, Mark, Bill. Oh, Zach, Bill, Alice, because Mark has left us.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you to all the panelists and everyone in attendance. It has been an amazing discussion, and it's really heartening to hear that all the different ways that we're all getting through the collapse of capitalist empire together. But yeah, just want to say endlessly, like, if you're not part of an organization, if you're not joining anything, if your city doesn't even have anything, like, do it. It's amazing. It's brilliant. It's the best way to network your community and ensure that, you know, if you're in need or your neighbor is in need, you'll be there to take care of each other as things only get worse. But thank you all again so much.
Bill, Alice, Christian.
Well, I want to thank you for letting me be on this panel. This is just a great community to see, and I know a lot of it, you know, the technical stuff I was talking about with the ERCOT system is complex, and people get bogged down in it. But it's exciting to see everyone here focused very much on the community and ground level. And I saw a lot of groups in Austin here doing that all this past week, and to see all of these organizations out here working on the local level is just amazing. It gives me hope in a way. I'd kind of lost hope for a while, but to see so many little blossomings of energy and excitement and power is just truly incredible to be part of. So thank you.
Alice.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me to be here. And it's been amazing meeting the other panelists, talking to people in other cities and other states. I guess I just want to end by reminding everyone that this isn't anywhere close to being over. For West Street, you know, this is our third major natural disaster in 4 years. And it doesn't feel good that we're, you know, it's almost become routine, this sort of disaster response. And during Harvey, the national coverage for that disaster lasted much longer than the national coverage for this. And I think that just speaks to the depth and the extent of all the overlapping crises that our nation is struggling with right now. But I think moving forward, continuing to care for each other and finding community. And also, it's something that I'm still trying to figure out, is trying to figure out the difference between survival programs and, you know, our vision, our collective vision for a better future. For example, you know, houses that we've rebuilt since Harvey, they were damaged again. They were flooded again in Imelda, and a lot of those were flooded again from burst pipes in this latest disaster. And that's not what we want, is to continue to be rebuilding the same houses over and over again. But that's also what people need to survive in this moment. So we're doing that, and we're making sure people's needs are met at the same time as organizing and building power towards something else bigger in the future.
Christian.
I just want to say thank you all for having me. It's great to be in a space with other similar like-minded individuals, knowing that this is not just happening in Dallas, but it's going on all over cities in Texas. We all share this same shared experience of what just happened last week. I just want to, what I was going to say, just want to say, if you want people to care, look up Public Narrative by Marshall Gantz. He organized with Martin Luther King Jr. during the Civil Rights Movement and Cesar Chavez. There is a way to get people to care, and there's a way to tell your story. And just thank you all for having me here.
Oh my God, Cristian, thank you so much for bringing Gantz into this conversation. You know, so for my final, I will pick up on that point, right? And so for my final point is this: people don't understand the world through facts. We understand the world through stories, right? And we have a compelling story. And I'm just going to say this, like the left, however you define that, we've got the winning fucking story. Like, because we're based on love and compassion and beauty and kindness. And if we told that meta story in our organizing all the time and then had good strategic planning around how to make that story reality, we will win. The left too often falls into the telling and fighting over the battle of the story, or the story of the battle and the minutia, instead of understanding the meta narrative. The right knows how to do that, and they do it better than we do. And we damn well better get better at it, because the world needs us, right? We need each other. So thank you to all the panelists. I also want to say thank you so much to Rachel and Kira behind the scenes who made all of this stuff happen. Thank you to Søren, who tapped me. So all y'all know, when Søren asked me to do this, I said, man, I don't think I'm the right person to do this. I don't even live in Texas anymore. But he insisted that I do it, and I'm so grateful that he did. And I also want to conclude by thanking Joe, the host normally of this show, for turning over this space to me/us. And I want to give Joe the final concluding parts. Peace, y'all.
Yeah, thanks so much for that, David, and thanks to all of our guests, which have already been thanked. But you know, so I don't want to leave anyone out. But I'll try anyway. But I think you're all clustered here together on my screen. To Zach, Bill, Cristian, Alice, Rain, David, and everyone else who contributed today. I know we had another speaker drop off earlier. Yeah, I mean, I think it's worth pointing out that in some sense, Shelter in Solidarity, now I think this is our 33rd episode over the last 9 months or so since the pandemic really hit here in where I am in Boston. And in some sense, it started as a mutual aid project too, you know, a kind of social and psychological kind of sustainer project, right? Facebook had a flutter one day when they sent the human beings home and turned controls over to the computers, and everything was crashing on Facebook. And we had the thought, what if they really did, you know, if Zuckerberg really did decide to bring down the hammer, you know, where would we be when our 1,000 activist allies are all through Facebook? And out of that kind of half-joking conversation came a very, very serious proposal to establish this space. And we've been going strong, you know, on our spare time, all of us working jobs. And so I just need to thank my co-producers of the show, some of whom have been named already, but I also want to, so that's Rachel Patton, Kira Mudliar, Sren Mudliar, Linda Liu, Tim Sheard, Marc Soderstrom. I also need to thank our co-sponsoring organizations, which include Hardball Press, a publisher of working class and progressive children's literature. Check out Hardball Press, Community Church of Boston, Dean Stevens and the folks at Community Church of Boston, the Liberty Tree Foundation for the Democratic Revolution, our newest co-sponsor, Encuentro Cinco, a hub for organizing and activism in downtown Boston, and last but not least, the journal Socialism and Democracy, a research journal for activists and organizers. Check it out, sdonline.org. Also, this particular program was co-sponsored by the DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, working group on mutual aid. So it's great. Our list of co-sponsors grows, and that's the idea. We're happy to open this space to you. We have a regular weekly show, bi-weekly, I should say, tomorrow, Thursday night, but we are now doing special edition shows too. If you have ideas for a topic, if you have ideas for a speaker, whether that person is you or someone else, please be in touch with us. Shelterandsolidarity.org. You can find us on Facebook. You can find us on YouTube. Please do. Please do, subscribe, share the content. All the archives of this show and of tonight's show will be available hopefully within the next couple days.